Well, in my mind, that is the story of rethinking what we think about the end. Because when we see the stories that Jesus tells, when we hear the warnings that he gives, it's really for the goal of us having it well with our souls. Not being afraid, not being kind of shaken, but to have the confidence that the one we wait for is looking for us, is anxious to be with us. Welcome. We're in a series, as we talked about, rethinking how we think about the end. And excuse me, last week we began in Matthew chapter 24 and looked at sort of Jesus' big statement about what that all kind of looks like, answering a question. Thanks, Dave. Answering the question of his disciples, of when this terrible event was going to happen in Jerusalem and when Jesus was going to turn. And Jesus answered both those questions with one single answer, and that's where we sometimes find some confusion. And if you're familiar with any things about the end times, you know there's lots and lots of warnings, right? It kind of is sort of the picture of it all. And one of the funny things about warnings for all of us is we tend to ignore them so well, right? We don't think they apply to us. I was driving on 29 this week going up through Columbia towards 70, and a little sign there that said, speed limit through this repair zone is 55, photo enforced. Warning. Apparently, it didn't apply to most people. Right? But you think about the other ones. Don't drink and drive. Doesn't apply to me. Haven't had that much to drink. Don't drive and talk on the phone. Don't text and drive. Or the one that I ignored this morning, I reached under the counter and pulled out a Q-tip. And if you look on the box of the Q-tip, it says in very big letters on the front of the box of Q-tips, do not stick in your ear. How many of you stick it in your ear? Exactly, right? So warnings come, and we just kind of go, hey, they're warnings, but they don't really mean something like that. And the problem is that warnings are there for a reason. I'm a huge fan. I love to look at sort of the sarcastic, cynical kind of stuff, and I love to look at kind of crazy warning labels that are on things. Anybody else like crazy warning labels? Well, a couple of us do, so I'll share it with a couple of us. Everybody else can just play along with us, all right? But sometimes it's because it's made in a different country, and because the translation just doesn't come out. For example, wrote down something. There was one on a butcher knife, and I'm sure this butcher knife was probably made in some place in Asia, because here's what the warning sign said: please keep out of children. Which I hope was a typo and not sort of something else. But hair dryers, hair dryers now have actually two warnings on them. The first one is this: do not use in the shower. And the second one is, do not use while sleeping. Those little electric rotary tools like a Drexel, anybody have those? They're great little tools, right? Here's the warning that comes on those. This product not intended to be used as a dental drill. Or the one that comes with the microwaves, do not use for drying pets. Which it might actually speed up, but it's a bad outcome, yeah. This one I love. This is one of my all-time favorites. It's on a can of air freshener, all right? Can of air freshener. Warning, for use by trained personnel only. Wait, it gets better. Keep out of reach of children and teenagers. If you have a child between the ages of grade 6 on up, you don't want to keep this out of reach of them, right? Some of you that teach like 6th, 7th, 8th grade, you just want to spray everybody down, right? I used to coach high school basketball and also coach middle school basketball. And honestly, one of the first lessons we would have, the first lessons, 2 big lessons. I'd hold a basketball and I would look at them and say, this is a basketball. See, it doesn't make a difference to you. For them, they had the same kind of response. Huh? And then we have to kind of talk about what that does and explain stuff. But the other thing was, I would go out and buy cans of deodorant for everybody. And I'd say, this is deodorant, and this, first lesson today is how to use this. Before we even talk about basketball, we're going to talk about how to use this kind of stuff, all right? Couple other ones. I saw this one this week as I was looking for these things. This is on a kid's Superman costume. Warning, wearing this garment does not enable you to fly, all right? The one that doesn't make, I mean, you kind of think it's a dumb one. On a bag of peanuts, warning, contains nuts. Two more. This is on a child's cough medicine, Warning, do not drive or operate machinery. Children's cough medicine, all right? And lastly, one of my favorites, on a bottle of Nytol, one of those sleep aids, warning, may cause drowsiness. Which is exactly why I'm taking this for, right? But warnings are all the way out there, and sometimes they're kind of crazy, but in this context of the end, Jesus tells lots and lots of warnings. And in fact, I'm going to give you the warning that we're going to look at today in one of the stories. Jesus, after all those descriptions last week, tells them sort of four short stories, four what we call parables, which tend to be just stories with a single point. And he tells four of them. Well, the first one is about this idea of being kind of complacent. You know, the boss takes off for a while, and you think, hey, he's not going to be back for a month. Woohoo, party in the office, right, kind of thing, you know, and he talks about the warning of what happens in that. The warning of today as we look at some whole wedding scene. There's the warning of how fear, as Pastor Dave prayed earlier, fear can overtake us, and fear can cause us not to do some stuff that ultimately will end up being very detrimental to us. And lastly, there's the warning to think about just the implications of being ready and waiting. And here's the warning that we're going to look at today over in Matthew chapter 25. This is the conclusion. This is the punchline of Jesus' story. So always be ready, that is, be alert, keep watch, because you don't know the day or the hour. Again, talking about this idea of the end. We heard about last week, about the day or the hour kind of thing. So that's Jesus' punchline, and we're going to figure out what the story is that gets us to that punchline in just a moment. But before we get there, I want to invite you to bow your heads and let's pray one more time together, all right? Lord, for some of us in this room, your return and the end of everything has been something we have heard our whole lives. And for some of us, it's been a scary thing. For some of us, we've heard it so much and heard it so often that it's become like all those other warnings in our lives. We hear them, but it just doesn't make any difference anymore. And I would just ask today that again we can hear your story in your heart through these words. A heart that wants above all else for us not just to be watching and waiting and ready, but for a heart that's been captured by you. For a life that has been transformed by you. For a mind and a soul that has been not only discovered by you, but loved by you, guided by you, and directed by you. And so today, I can only pray for myself that you would open up those small cracks that I have in my life where I need the warning, where I need the reminders, and where I need the assurance that what you care about and think about for me is so much better than what I care and think about so often. So be with us now as we turn back to your word to hear you in your name. Amen. Now, the story we look at today is an unusual wedding story because it's all about the bridesmaids. And if you've ever been at a wedding, you know it is not all about the bridesmaid. That's why bridesmaids get those ugly dresses, right? Because if a bride has some girlfriends and she thinks, man, they might look better than me on this day, I'm going to fix that. Because I'm going to give you one ugly dress so everybody knows I'm the star of the show, right? I mean, because that's weddings. Weddings are all about the brides. When I'm getting guys ready for a wedding, I have to remind them that. This day has nothing to do with you. You just happen to be the guy that's standing there with her. It's all about her. But in this story that Jesus is going to tell has nothing to do about the bride, but it has everything to do about the bridesmaids. And again, it's in this context that Jesus has told this sort of, he's telling the disciples an answer to the question they had about when is this temple going to be torn down and when are you going to return? Because they saw it, as we talked about last week, as one and the same event, when in reality they are two very distinct events. So here's where we pick up. Matthew chapter 25, verse 1. At that time, at this end time, as Jesus is talking about, at that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 bridesmaids. How many bridesmaids? Because it's a big party, right? How many of you had 10 bridesmaids in your party? Anybody? I'm going to drink of water, so I have to break some time here. 10? How many had 10? Raise your hands real high. Anybody have 9? 8? I feel bad for you folks. 7? 6? How many had nobody at their wedding? Anybody have nobody at their wedding? All right. Yeah. Excuse me. So, at the time, the kingdom of heaven is going to be like these 10 bridesmaids who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Which right now, if you don't know anything about biblical history and kind of this context and when Jesus talks, you're going, why would they take a lamp with them? And they're wearing these little flashlight things they had, Jerry, those kind of things. Is this going to be kind of a specialty kind of wedding? We're outside in the dark. I mean, what's the story here? Let me give you a little background. We have talked about this before. In Jewish culture, getting married was a whole different. You think it's a big deal here? It's a whole big deal there. Because this was a chance for two families to kind of join together. Not just the guy and the gal, but their whole families, and had lots of implications, and this took time, and a guy would, propose, and if the family said yes, and she said yes, then it was sealed, and then he had like up to a year to come back to claim his bride. But he had to go home and get a place ready for her. Had to get something set up for her. And so if he'd already been planning for this, he might have already had it set up. And so he might come back that night. He might come back next week. He might come back 6 months, 9 days, and 23 hours from right at this moment. You just didn't know. So everybody had to be ready because when he showed up, bam, the wedding was on. And so the bridesmaids here are planning for that. And so they have their lamps because he might come at nighttime. And if he comes at nighttime, you got to be able to see. They didn't have street lights back then. So they grab their lamps and they go out to meet the bridegroom because he might show up. And maybe they know something about the story. They're expecting him to show up earlier because, hey, they heard he's going to do this. And 5 of them, Jesus tells us, are foolish, and 5 of them were wise, that is, sensible and prudent. Now, the term here in the original language that says foolish is more than just kind of not so that they make poor choices, as much as they're just not the brightest bridegrooms around, all right? So you got 5 that aren't really so bright, and you got 5 that are wise, that are sensible and prudent. But the reality is we don't know how to decide between those. I mean, they all have the same ugly dresses on, right? So we know that, there isn't much to separate them. But Jesus says there's going to be 5 that aren't so bright, and 5 that are wise, that are sensible and prudent. And the 5 foolish, and he tells us what happens, 5 foolish bridesmaids took their lamps, but they did not take more oil for the lamps to burn. So that's the differentiation. There's this idea of lamps. Because, he says, the wise, the sensible, prudent ones took their lamps and more oil in their jars. And because the bridegroom was late, that is delayed, they became drowsy and went to sleep. So the question for us has to be, what's the difference? Well, what's the difference between the foolish and wise? And we might want to go right to the oil, but wait for this. Really the difference is how they handle the delay. Because it says the bridegroom is late. He doesn't show up. They all get a little tired, a little drowsy. And they fall asleep. Because he has taken a long, long time. And we don't know how long, whether this is just one night or this is weeks or months. Again, in that context, they would have said it could have been any time. But they're all waiting in their lovely outfits, got their lamps ready. But the difference is how they wait, how they handle the delay. And the reality is, the surprise is that the groom takes longer than expected. And all of you know how it is when somebody's delayed, when you're having to put off getting something done. Some of you, I know I've talked to you recently, some of you have been trying to sign some papers on a house you're buying, and it's been like months because every time you do it, it falls through. Some of you are waiting for some other legal stuff to get handled, right? And it just kind of keeps, they got a court date, and then they moved to court date, and here's the reality for all of us. Whether you're back 2,000 years ago or even today, we are all terrible at waiting. True? I mean, nobody likes to wait. Oh, my friends that are doctors, I always joke with them, The thing they do is called a practice. They'll try to tell us something right at the start, right? And they have a whole room dedicated for waiting. That's right. And what's one of your number one frustrations of going to the doctor's office? Waiting, right? Especially if it's a bunch of sick people in there. But we are terrible at waiting, and they were terrible at waiting back then too. And at midnight, someone cried out, "The bridegroom is coming, come and meet him." So it's at midnight, which is not very late, right? So this has got to be on some days. It's not like just that night the girls get all tired about 10 o'clock. It's been a long, hard day. We just got to go to sleep. Someone would have said, no, this is sometime. But it happens at nighttime. The bridegroom shows up. They're called to come out. And then all the bridesmaids woke up and got their lamps ready, to which they discovered something. But the foolish ones said to the wise, that is the sensible, prudent ones, can we have some oil, please? Because our lamps, they're going out. To which the wise ones say, the sensible, prudent ones say, no. No. Can't, because the oil we have might not be enough for us and you. You've probably seen those signs that maybe you got into a store. It says, your failure to plan does not constitute an emergency on my part, right? That's kind of this idea. They say no. But they give them some advice because they're wise, prudent. Go to the people who sell oil and buy some for yourselves. Now, if you've been around a church any length of time, you have probably heard someplace this story before. How many of you heard this story before? Quite a few have heard this story before. And you have probably heard the conclusion that this is about, the oil, and the oil represents the Holy Spirit. Yeah, you heard that kind of idea, the Holy Spirit, is the idea that you gain, you gather up the Holy Spirit in your life so that you can make it through this long wait. I want you to know when you've heard that, that has nothing to do with this story. Because when Jesus tells parables, it's always about a single point, all right? It's not about a bunch of points. It's not deciding, looking at this piece and that piece. In fact, we're going to discover something here that is going to bother you, for some of you, because you've heard this idea that, if you're ready and waiting, my job is to be ready and waiting. That's what Jesus' conclusion was, right? I have to watch and be alert. Watch and be alert. But we're going to discover something from this story that Jesus tells that is the opposite, at least in our mind, of what it looks like to watch and be alert. So, the wise ones say, hey, go get your own oil. We can't share because we might not have enough because, we hear he's coming, but we don't know how far off he is and how long the wedding's going to be. And so they go out to buy some oil. And while they go out, dun, 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 the bridegroom shows up. And he's all got his tuxedo on, or whatever was the version of tuxedo back then, He's looking handsome and sharp. He's ready to go get his bride, seal the deal, all this kind of stuff. And so they go out. The bridesmaids who are ready, they go out to meet him, and they go with him to this big wedding feast because it's ready to go, because he has finally showed up. And here's a couple of conclusions. Number one, it is possible to be both wise and asleep. To which our sensibilities, and especially our church sensibilities, say, oh, no, you can't be wise and asleep. You have to be wise and awake, right? Because you're being alert. But let me ask you, there were 10 bridesmaids at the start things, right? 5 that were kind of not so bright, right? And 5 that were important theological question. How many of them slept? All 10 of them fell asleep, sound asleep. So, it's possible to be both wise and asleep. Not only that, it is possible to be asleep and ready. And some of you experience that. Going on a long trip, you're anxious about it. You have a lousy night of sleep the night before because you're afraid you're going to miss your alarm clock to go off, right? Got your bags packed. Some of you even kind of get your clothes because you're going to be traveling clothes. You already got them on because it's a big deal, right? And some of you are the kind of person that wakes up and goes, oh yeah, I just got to get a few more things. Like all of my clothes. Have you seen my, right, But it's possibly both asleep and ready, which kind of blows our mind because, again, in sort of church circles, it's always been about staying awake, staying alert. You got to be ready at any moment, because something could happen, right? To watch and be ready apparently is a little different. What goes on? Because they've gone in with the bridegroom now. The door is closed. It is locked. The party's starting to take place. And lo and behold, the others came back. And they knock on the door. And they say, sir, open the door to let us in because we got our oil now. We've gone and purchased oil. They have oil now, so it can't be this kind of Holy Spirit thing because they have simply followed the wise advice. But in failing to do some stuff earlier, now they find themselves locked out. To which the bridegroom comes to the door. The bridegroom. Not some help, but the bridegroom, or at least the guy who's supposed to be up there getting married to somebody. He comes to the door and says, I tell you the truth. I don't know you. To which the girls in the ugly clothes have to go, really? Look, they match, can't you figure that? They match everybody else that's gone in there. Come on, we're just a little late, and they have their own excuses, well, we're going to do this and that, and we got the oil, blah, 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 They're going off, and the guy's like, simply, no, I don't know you. And I don't know about you, when I've read the story, it's like, how is it possible for him not to know them? And the reality is, he doesn't know them because they have failed to be there on the right time in order to be considered a guest. And if you got there late, you weren't one of the guests. You were somebody else. And so not knowing them isn't just that I don't recognize your face. Not knowing them is you have offended this whole process. See, I have had the privilege of performing lots and lots and lots of weddings over my years. It doesn't happen at every wedding, but an occasional wedding, one of the parents decides they're going to show up late. Sometimes really late. Which causes everybody some angst because you can't get the wedding going until one of either the groom's parents show up or the bride's parents show up. And when they're really late, everybody gets kind of anxious. Everybody's sitting in the room like this, starts to look at their watches, get out their phones, start doing some other stuff. You just get kind of off in different distance. And by being late, they disrupt the whole thing. And sometimes at weddings, we've had them say, you know what? They're not the immediate family, so let's just do it. And I've had people show up just as the couple is walking down the aisle. And what they've communicated in that lateness is they didn't really care. And because they didn't care, they weren't really part of it. And because they weren't part of it, they're not really known. See, it's not just who you know. It's that you are known. And according to Jesus, the way we're known is that we have kind of thought about and planned about and considered what would happen if he doesn't come back, if the end doesn't happen when we think it's going to happen. What do you do in the big delay of things? So let me wrap this up for a moment. A couple foolish conclusions about the foolish bridesmaids. Number one, there are some things you have to do for yourself. You can't just show up and think it's going to be a great time. Apparently, you got to kind of think things through ahead of it. And not only that, there are some things you simply cannot get at the last minute. Now, I know some of you are thinking about, kind of elbowing somebody right now. Pay attention. The pastor's right on this. I've been telling you that. We got to be better on time. You're the one that always makes me late. Jesus' point is very simple. If we don't consider the possibilities of having to wait, then sometimes it is too late to get the stuff we need. Because they go out and get their oil, right? They've gone out and gotten all the stuff they need, but it's just been too late in order to be part of what's going on in that wedding. And so Jesus finishes by saying, always. So because of the story, always be ready That is, be alert. That is, keep watch, because you don't know the day or the hour. And we are too often overwhelmed by our insufficiency. And it's too easy to look at the story and wonder if you're the wise one or a foolish one. Which, by the way, there's always somebody glad to tell you the answer to that. But what if the story is not about our insufficiency? And being overwhelmed by, not going right away to the foolish ones, but going to the wise ones instead. Going to the story that Jesus tells. Because Jesus tells the story for a very specific reason, and that is simply this. He is not going to show up as soon as everybody thinks he is. It has been 2,000 years. And you can read through the New Testament part of your Bible and see that they expected him to show up in their lifetimes. You can go back in history, the stories of history, and see at different moments in history that people talked about. We think the world's gotten so bad. In the 500s and the 800s and the thousands. Turnham Williams, 1,000 and 2,000. Things have gotten so bad. He's got to show up. And Jesus' point is simply, if you fall asleep, that's not the bad thing. It's about if you're ready, even if you fall asleep. If you've been okay with the delay. But it's so easy for us to get overwhelmed by our own insufficiency and kind of put ourselves in the story and forget what's more important. That is, that we are underwhelmed by God's sufficiency. Because everything's set up for these bridesmaids. All they have to do is that when the bridegroom comes, to be ready to go out, have their lamps, and be ready to go along with the party. That's all they have to do. Somebody else provided the ugly dresses for them. Somebody else has got the chicken around the meal they're going to have. All they have to do is be ready when he shows up to run out and greet him. So let me kind of wrap it up a little early today. I think the takeaway for me is to don't be thrown off by the delays. His delay, but not just his delay as far as the end of all things, but his delay at times in my own life. When the stuff I really thought he was going to do by now doesn't happen by now. To not be thrown off by the delays that when I thought I was going to be farther along in my career, or farther along in my schooling, or farther along in paying off this debt, and I don't find myself in that spot. Because the reality is, for all of us experience delays. All of us will experience our hopes and our dreams not necessarily being dashed, though at times that is, but oftentimes being delayed, being disrupted, not coming through in the time when we thought they would. And Jesus tells this story so that we're not thrown off by the delay, because if we are, we're kind of like these not so bright bridesmaids. But if we're not caught off guard, we're like the wise ones who slept. See, faith isn't that God will, but that he can. Somebody said that, I don't know who it was, but I just remember it. But when I heard it, it hit me because it is so easy for me, and I've heard people talk about that. It's to claim God will. Have faith in that God will. Claim it, name it, do all that kind of stuff. But the reality is that's not faith. Faith is the belief that God can. Whether he will or not, that's up to God. But that he can do something is the faith that can get us through some things. So here's what I want you to do as we wrap up today. And then next week we're going to talk about kind of the surprising story, kind of the clueless story that Jesus tells in Matthew chapter 25 about some farm animals. But let me just say to you as we wrap up, here's what I'd like to challenge you to do this week, because tomorrow is daylight savings time. I don't know who's daylight saving tomorrow. It is taking an hour away of my sleep, or an hour away of my day, whichever way you want to look at it, right? But this week especially, I want to challenge you to keep some reserve in the tank. Because it is so easy to hear, you got to go all in, you got to go all out, you got to give it your all the time. When in reality, at least according to this story of Jesus, keeping some reserve in tank is not a bad idea. You've probably heard it, life is not a sprint, it's a marathon. I don't even think it's a marathon. I think it's a life. Life has its moments where you stop, where you sleep, where you leave the course of kind of the journey, the kind of the normal routine. You go on vacations. And if we forget to have some reserve in the tank, we put ourselves on edge and on verge of having enough to get us through. And that's what separated the wise from the foolish. The wise had enough to make it, had enough in the tank when it came time to go and meet this bridegroom. See, I love this story because, like so many Jesus' story wrapped around this whole end time, his whole return picture, is the reminder that we have made it something else. We've made it about not being lost, being afraid, kind of doing all the stuff I have to do to make sure I'm in. When in reality, the stories Jesus tells are there to remind us that a delay has the same tendency for all of our lives. To make us forget, to make us get complacent, to make us run out of steam, to make us get fearful. In every one of these stories he tells, to remind us again that it's not about waiting and watching necessarily for his return, but waiting and watching for someone who's coming back for our return. See, one of my favorite passages in all the Bible is we're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And it's a story that I oftentimes at a funeral or memorial service I'll tell. But I don't have the slides up here. But Paul, he's writing to this church in Thessalonica, the modern-day Turkey area. And they apparently have some confusion about what happens when you die. But in the midst of that, he has this great line about kind of what takes place. And then he says, when Jesus returns, here's how it looks. The Lord himself returns. And I love that because he doesn't say he sends a bunch of angels to get everybody to take him to heaven. Doesn't say Gabriel shows up, who apparently Gabriel's a big guy, or a big angel, I should say, not a guy. But it's this picture that Jesus is so anxious to be not only with his people, but to be with you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and me, that he can't wait any longer. And so he leaves home to come be with us, to come get us, because it's about him being with us. And all these stories are told so that we don't forget it's about him being with us. And that watching and waiting should be based on the anticipation of us having the chance to be with him visually, physically, and to experience him in a different way than we ever have before, based on the way we've already experienced him in our lives, and the way that he comes in and changes our lives and changes our minds and our hearts. And these stories are not about us. They're about him. And while there are warnings in them, they are warnings that we don't forget, so we don't forget that they are about how much he loves us and cares about us and how he wants to be there for us through all these things.